I'm just grateful that we found each other, regardless of whatever is specifically wrong with you. There is definitely something wrong with you, but we belong together. Hello! Today I am reviewing viewer recommendations, and I am very excited to share my thoughts with you. I have 5 different recommendations that I'm going to discuss today. If you've made a recommendation yourself and you don't see it included, that doesn't necessarily mean that I'm not going to review it. Every time someone recommends a book or an author to me, I write it down. Just because you don't see it today doesn't necessarily mean you won't see it in the future. In fact, you probably will, because I had a lot of fun reading these books, so I definitely want to do it again. We have a variety. We have some extreme horror, we have some sci-fi, and we have some I don't know what to call it. We'll just, weird. So the first book I want to talk about is called Fetal Backwash, and it's by Judith Sonnet. I'll put on the screen who recommended the books because I notice sometimes people change their usernames, so I don't want to say the wrong thing. The first thing that I noticed for Fetal Backwash is that I could not find it on my Kindle app. I could not find it on Amazon. I did a little bit of digging, come to find out that it was banned on Amazon, presumably due to the title. The content of the book, I would not say is any worse than other things that I have read from Amazon, specifically on Kindle Unlimited. I don't know why else it would be kind of singled out that way. I ended up having to access this through godless.com. Now, this made me very nervous because because the only time I've ever had to go to godless.com is when I read Baby in a Blender. That was by far Baby in a Blender has been the most traumatizing book that I have read so far. So it did make me a little nervous going into this, knowing I had to go through godless.com. I'm like, oh my goodness, what am I getting into? However, I was so pleasantly surprised. I had said that I wanted to read Judith Sonnet again, but find a book that wasn't a 10-day challenge. Let's get into the plot and then I'll get into the details a little bit. So, Fetal Backwash. Freaking name, sorry. We're introduced to our main character. Her name is Flo. She is giving birth to a child on a toilet. The man she's living with is named Hank, and he is not a nice man. He is banging on the bathroom door, causing a ruckus. She's going through it. She's a little bit busy at the moment, but he's just trying to get in there. He's not happy. He wants her out, and she's concerned about the safety of her child. Now, turns out that the baby she gave birth to is not a normal baby. Should I leave it there? It's kind of reminiscent of Rosemary's Baby. The baby ain't quite right. Things I liked about this book. We're setting this scene right off the bat, and this woman who is going through something that is very intense and very difficult under the best of circumstances. Here she is living in less than ideal circumstances, in poverty, who suffer from substance abuse and depression. She has suffered abuse from numerous people in her life, and you feel a lot of sympathy for the situation that she's in and what she's going through. But then it takes such a wild turn, and this is the thing that was fascinating. I made the mistake when I first looked at this book. It was listed as Bizarro Splatterpunk. Like Bizarro, I didn't know what that meant. And like a big dumb idiot, I did not look it up right away, but I made a mental note. I was like, oh, I should make sure to look that up before I do my video. However, I got about halfway through the book and things were getting real weird. So then I decided to look up Bizarro and come to realize it is a genre in and of itself. I was so excited when I saw this because the genre of Bizarro seems like so much fun. It's gonna be weird, basically, is what the genre is. Once I understood what it was supposed to be, I started to enjoy it so much. It's very sexually explicit and gory, the body horror, but this book is so funny. Judith Sonnet is funny. I don't want to give specific spoilers away, but there are parts in this story where it'll be like something extremely violent and depraved will be happening to a character, and another character will just like look over and be like, hey, stop that, and just like resume what they're doing. Just a very underwhelming response to something so intense happening. There was parts of this story that made me laugh so hard reading it. I enjoyed this book a lot. But it's not the sort of thing that if you go in trying to take it seriously, don't do that. Know what you're getting into and you will enjoy this so much more. It's so weird. It's so funny. Truly, thank you so much for recommending this book. I enjoyed it thoroughly. I feel like a whole genre has opened up to me for me to explore. I'm very intrigued by that. And also, seeing this side of Judith Sonnet, what I felt like I was waiting for, what I sensed was there with her 10-day challenges, but wasn't quite getting satiated for me. And I also was going through some of her other stories, and some of them are so silly and so ridiculous. I'm thinking about doing another one of my author focus videos where I read a bunch of books from the same author. I'm kind of thinking of doing her next because I'm very intrigued based off of this book, and I really want to look at some of her other goofier stories. Thank you. This was so gross and disturbing and over the top and ridiculous, and I enjoyed it so much. Next up, we have What Good Girls Do by Jonathan Butcher. This one was a little bit different. It's what I was expecting, but also not what I was expecting. We have this girl who is a teenager who has been isolated and locked up as aid by a man. She calls him daddy, but in this day and age, it's hard to know. It's kind of insinuated that it's her father. But she has been held captive in a basement type torture chamber thing, and that's all she knows. Some events unfold. When the girl ends up escaping, she ends up running to the neighbor's house. So we have these two perspectives of the young girl and the neighbor woman. It's not the goriest or anything like that. When you're reading this, the language is disturbing. You have this girl, her entire life has been her being trained to be the perfect sex slave, basically, to be infantilized but also sexualized. So you have this girl who, when she refers to her own body parts, she refers to them in a very sexualized way because that's the way that she's spoken to. For example, if she were to talk about her coochie, she's not going to just say her coochie. She's going to say her soft or her tight or her whatever. Like, she's going to describe it in the way that she's been taught to describe it. But then she also does not know very basic vocabulary words. She doesn't know the word carpet. She doesn't know the word pants. Completely neglected in terms of education, in terms of socialization. Her entire life revolves around being the perfect play toy for her father and for like a few of his weird, creepy friends. When you're in her perspective, she's very childlike in her maturity and her knowledge, but then she just says very vulgar things and it's uncomfortable to read. And it's interesting because then we go over to the neighbor woman. It kind of starts off with her and her husband getting into some role play stuff where she's doing similar things to what our character is doing, but she's a grown woman and she's doing it by choice and she enjoys it. And this girl, because of her lack of socialization, because of her lack of life experience outside of this room, she really cannot grasp a reality where girls are treated differently. I got a similar feeling reading about her that I did when I read Playground by Aaron Burgard, and I was very, very upset about one of the characters in that book and I wanted to coddle him. I would also like to coddle this girl. This is what we're gonna do. I'm thinking blanket fort. Movie night. Movie night with a blanket fort. Popcorn. I mean, we need to have some kind of sweet in there, maybe brownies. Huh? Some kind of wholesome movie. Next day, intensive therapy. You figure a girl who's gone through these things and experienced the things that she has, you don't expect her to act and behave in a normal way. This feels more heavy when you're reading it. It's not even really a complaint. It's just a thought I had when I read it. I wasn't 100% on board with the ending. Not necessarily that the events that unfold could not lead to the ending. I just wasn't 100% on board that, as shown, that it would. It just felt like there was a bit of a leap there that I wasn't quite ready to make with the author. So I would have needed either the book to be longer, I think, to really be on board with the ending, or the ending would need to be a little bit less severe, I guess. This one definitely pulls on your heartstrings a little bit more. And also I do think something that is important to note, that there is a specific line in this book. This girl is making statements based solely off of her experience. She has been victimized specifically by men in her life. And so she is under the impression that girls aren't like that. Girls aren't perpetrators, so she feels safe going to girls, being around girls. Obviously, girls, women can be perpetrators. This girl is speaking clearly off of her own experience, but if you're just trying to eliminate any risk, then you just can't be around people. It's not always obvious who's dangerous and who's not. Definitely cannot be dumbed down to something like gender or sexuality or anything like that. Like, there's no way to just categorize people based off of how they look to know whether or not they're safe. It was a very emotionally intriguing story. It really gave me a lot to think about and chew on, which is something that I appreciate in a book. So I did really enjoy it. So thank you so much for recommending it. Okay, so this next one. Now, they specifically said The Pig and the House. So far, I have only read The Pig, and this is by Edward Lee. I believe the original comment said something along the lines of, if you want extreme horror, check out The Pig. That was really all I knew about the story going into it. I never looked up the plot. I was just like, well, that's enough for me, and I that was enough. This book has a hell of an opener. It gave me the same type of energy if you've ever read Talia. The first opening line of Talia by Daniel J. Volpe gets your attention, and this is right up there with attention-getting opening lines. Our plot. Leonard is a young man, I think he's like 19. He writes this short story called The Confessor, and he wants to make a short film and submit it to one of those, like, Sundance Film Festival or something like that. However, he does not have the funds to afford the cameras and all the equipment that he needs. He tries to steal the equipment. He does not succeed his first try, but then he ends up trying again and does succeed. One thing leads to another. He ends up doing different types of film work involving underground adult filmmaking. We're talking about the weird stuff, including animal stuff. The plot of this is basically him kind of being forced into this less than ideal situation and just let the chaos go. This book has moments of humor. It does get to the point where you think things are kind of weird and it's slightly confusing, but then it turns out that there are, I won't get into specifics, but there are some supernatural elements to the story. Without the context of the other two stories, I am very curious where those go. What happens from here, I don't know. I will say, if I'm being honest, it didn't really make me feel much of anything. Leonard, he talks about extremely traumatizing experiences. The way he describes those experiences is just like, oh, and then this happened, and then this. He's very emotionally detached, which makes sense as a possible coping mechanism. However, as a result of that, it is a little bit harder to feel emotionally connected to him as a character when he's not emotionally connected to himself, if that makes sense. Baby stuff and things with animals. Those are the hardest for me to read. And so once I understood what the story was about, it made me a little nervous. But I will say, if that's something that's hard for you to read as well, even though it does talk about that, it doesn't describe the animals in a way where they're suffering. The things that they go into detail with involve more people. And even then, there is, not just with Leonard, just with all of the characters in general, there is a certain level of emotional detachment, but even then, it's not that it doesn't make sense. It makes sense for the characters, for the circumstances that they're in. It's just one of those things that even though it makes sense, it doesn't change the fact that it makes it harder for me to care about these characters. I don't think it's the worst extreme horror that I've read, but also I have not read the other two books. So it might, who knows? Who knows what'll happen? Not me, not yet. Thank you so much for recommending this to me because it's left me very curious to read the other two so I get the full experience. Next up is a little bit of a change of pace. We have a sci-fi book. This recommendation was not about this specific story, but it was just for the author in general. This viewer recommended the author Michael Shea as sort of a more modern day H.P. Lovecraft. touching on sci-fi horror that for me to check out because I struggled trying to read H.P. Lovecraft. I decided to read the Autopsy because that's what the collection was titled after, so it seemed like a good place to start. Okay, so my camera died, so I'm having to record the rest of this on my phone. I'm really sorry. I know that the quality is a lot worse. We'll be back to normal next time. We were talking about the autopsy. So we have a mortician. His name is Dr. Carl Winters. This town has a mine where there was some sort of explosion, implosion thing that happened, and a bunch of the men there were killed. There's an investigation into what caused the explosion. It's a matter of whether or not the insurance is going to cover it. It's a whole big thing. And so he is coming there to give a second opinion on the cause of death of these men. And there does seem to be a friendship between him and the sheriff of this town, so that's kind of why he's coming in from elsewhere. Now, before this big explosion, there were some missing people. There's a lot of other things surrounding. It's not just that the mine collapsed. Like, there were things leading up to that that made it suspicious. So he's there to do the autopsy on these men, and some strange things reveal themselves. So, before we get really into the nitty-gritty of everything, it was kind of giving me Twilight Zone vibes. And then we get around the 2/3 of the way in, and to be honest, I really started to struggle. Not because of the story. The story was interesting. It gave me that feeling of I was reading outside of my depth. Like, I'm not smart enough to read this. That was the type of feeling I was starting to get. Sometimes I didn't know the words and I would just Google them, and that's fine. I have no problem looking up a word here or there. But sometimes, for me at least, let's say I'm familiar with all the words in the paragraph, but a lot of the words are not necessarily common in my vocabulary. When there's a bunch of those words all together, it can become hard to follow. I could read it, but I had to try. It required effort on my part to read it. I really had to slow down and take my time. There's a couple things about this. One, I pushed through my moments of frustration and my little bit of struggle. I still was able to understand the story itself. My concern when I get to sections like that is, what if this is important? What if I'm missing pivotal information, if I don't make sure that I'm processing this paragraph or this sentence or whatever? You don't always know for sure at the time. I have such an earnest desire to be able to read stuff like this more easily. I want to be able to read it and enjoy it and not get frustrated. But the thing about that is that if I want to get better, I have to push myself, right? I'm not going to get better if I just never read outside of my comfort zone. I'm not sure if it's always even the author's intention for us to pick up on all those things. There were times where he was using a lot of anatomical verbiage. It makes sense in the story because you have a mortician and someone else he's speaking to that's very smart. And so it makes sense, but you wouldn't necessarily expect that the layman is going to understand what they're talking about without having to look it up. So I think sometimes you just need to be okay with not understanding it completely. What I liked about this story, it has the things that I liked about H.P. Lovecraft, the concepts, the vibes. Despite the struggles that I as an individual had a bit, I did think it was well written. It was fun, and it touched on the sci-fi, the creepy sci-fi elements that I do enjoy. This book has other stories from this author that I want to read more of. So thank you so much for recommending that to me, because I do want to get better, and I can't get better if I don't challenge myself. So, and our last one does not really have a specific genre that I would describe it as, so I'm just going to call it weird. I read several short stories from the collection by Bentley Little. Now, these are very short stories. We're looking at like between 10 and 20 pages on average. I did read a few. I'm going to talk about two specifically that did stick out to me. When this was recommended to me, they specifically mentioned the story Montia. I did make sure to read that one, and that's one of the ones I want to talk about. This is going to be a little bit hard to talk about without giving spoilers, just because they're such short stories. So just go with me on this, okay? We have Andrew and his wife Barbara. Andrew has come home early from work. He wasn't feeling well. Barbara did not know that he was coming home early. And so when he gets home, she's not there. She's at the store or something. And he finds lots of weird stuff going on. He finds the word Monteith written down on a piece of paper. No context, just the word. And his mind immediately starts to spiral beyond what I would think of as a reasonable response. Is this someone that she's cheating on me with? Is this some sort of deity that she's worshiping? Like, it's just his mind just goes all over the place. So at first you're thinking this man is a raving lunatic, but he continues to find other kind of sketchy things around the house. He finds numerous dead animals in different places around the property. All these things adding together, really making him feel like he has stumbled across some sort of revelation about his wife. He just doesn't know what it is because she didn't know that he was coming home early. He's convinced that she would have hidden everything. She would have concealed it all if she had known. He's very happy in his life and in his marriage. And he feels like he doesn't know what it is, but he is convinced that something huge and life-altering is going on. And he doesn't want to know. So he just never confronts her about it within the story. They never have a conversation about the things that he found. And I loved it. Your mind reading this is constantly flipping. Like for me, his reaction to seeing this word written down on a piece of paper, the conclusions that he's jumping to are just so outlandish and so over the top. But then you see this other stuff and you're like, well, that is kind of weird. And the idea of him just being so scared, so convinced that if he confronts his wife about this, that his life will just never be the same if he does. That there is no going back, that there is something, some deep, dark secret that just cannot see the light of day. Because if it does, if it ever sees the light of day, there is no going back. He will never have the life that he currently does if he confronts his wife about this. And so he just doesn't. He cares about maintaining the status quo more than he cares about satiating his curiosity. Loved it. Would I react the same way? Absolutely not. My reaction when my husband came home would have been like, I've had such a weird day, let me tell you about it. I can understand him just repressing it, but I do think, despite the weirdness, I do think that it is within the realm of possibilities that this man is a raving lunatic, but not raving. He's not raving. He's just crazy. He's a silent lunatic. Like, not raving, just quiet. The other thing that it kind of made me think of, which I don't think was intentional, but it's just sort of where my mind went when I read it, at least for me, but I know I'm not alone in this. When you're a kid, secrets seem so playful. As a kid, the idea of going up to your attic and finding a chest filled with secret letters, or like, I don't know, finding some creepy book like from Hocus Pocus or something like that, like finding a pentagram on the ground underneath the carpet. It's seen as so playful and fun, and as an adult the vibe is not the same. The idea of stumbling upon stuff like that actually has real world ramifications for you and the life that you've built for yourself. Although I do feel like if I did find a chest full of secret letters, I would still be pretty stoked about it. It would not be fun, though, if it led to the conclusions that he's coming to. If unveiling secrets made me concerned for the faithfulness or sanity of my spouse, that makes it less fun. The other one I want to talk about is called The Murmurous Haunt of Flies. The plot. We have this couple who have gone to this farm to visit the man's grandpa. There are some bathhouses that he's like, hey, they're like far on the edge of the property, just off the property, on the property, not clear. But they're haunted. Don't go there. Don't go there. And you find weird things go on. Not just affecting his grandfather, but other nearby farms, that there have been hog mutilations and just weird things. So of course, what do you want to do when someone tells you not to do something? You want to do the thing. When you hear grown adults talk about things being haunted, there's a part of you that maybe might suspect they're being a bit melodramatic. I know that there are a lot of people who very strongly believe in that stuff, and no disrespect to you at all. This story also had quite an open ending that I enjoyed. It had this moment. It's a very brief moment, but I found it surprisingly tender. At this point in the story, the grandfather has lost his wife, and the grandson talks about how different the house feels. This kitchen that they're in talking, how it used to feel like this warm, welcoming space. And now, without his grandmother there and his grandpa living there alone, the energy of the house has changed. Our pets, our family, the people we surround ourselves with are the ones that give things meaning. Your house or your apartment, your living space, you might really appreciate it aesthetically, but that will never compare to the memories that you make there. Now, this story also kind of made me think about something that I would also guess was not intentional. The idea of this haunted bathhouse that you are curious to go check it out, but you're also scared of it and all of that. It made me think about how rare it is and how difficult it is to actually be afraid of things like that as an adult. I think back on when I was a kid and the first time that I ever watched The Blair Witch Project, or the first time that I watched The Ring, and that feeling of watching a movie in the dark and feeling afraid to go use the bathroom. Feeling afraid from a movie, like genuinely afraid that something bad is going to happen. Being afraid when you go to bed that night. I cannot remember the last time that a movie or a book actually made me afraid. Disturbed? Yes. Grossed out? Yes. It's really not that easy to accomplish anymore. And so it kind of made me think of that, of under these circumstances, I probably would not go to it simply because the grandpa asked me not to. Out of respect, I would choose not to do that. But I would not be afraid to go check out the haunted bathhouse. There are real life dangers and threats all the time. I'm not referring to that type of fear, but as far as for entertainment, that I wish I could find something that would actually make me scared. I also read Skin, which is about this tourist attraction on the side of the road that is made out of human flesh. I read Against the Pale Sand. I mean, he warns you ahead of time that this is fairly plotless. That was the weirdest one. There is a very unusual and disturbing visual in that I didn't know how to feel about. A man, his car breaks down or he runs out of gas or something, and he ends up having to stop into this place, and he just basically witnesses the weirdness. And the other one, The Woods Be Dark. They do be dark though. There's this house on the edge of the woods, and people will emerge from the woods, and if you're not safe inside or if you don't protect yourself, they'll attack you, and you have to do this ritual in order to make them stop doing that. Those were not bad. They just didn't stick out to me the way that the other two did. In general, I enjoyed reading these thoroughly. I do not mind things being open-ended at all, especially with short stories. This was just more weirdness that I really did enjoy, so thank you so much for recommending it. So that is all of the books I've read so far from viewer recommendations. I had a lot of fun doing this, so I would like to do this more. If you're still here, thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. And maybe I'll see you the next time around. Bye. The man that she's living with, who is presumably the father's child, who is presumably the father's child, oh my gosh.